We've examined some of the politics behind the federal judiciary. In this last file in our module, I'd like to discuss the influence of the Supreme Court and also some of its limitations. We'll specifically look at the court's landmark desegregation ruling in Brown v. Board of Education as an example of both the court's ability to influence government and politics, but also the limits of its power. One limitation on the Supreme Court's power is that it must wait for cases to reach the bench. The Supreme Court can't simply say it doesn't like a law that Congress passed and take it up for immediate consideration. Instead, it must wait for cases to develop over time through the judicial system. Some party in society has to show that they've been damaged by a law to challenge its constitutionality in court. A case has to make it through the trial court and circuit court levels before reaching the Supreme Court. So the court can only rule and set precedents on cases that actually make it all the way through the legal process. A second limitation on the court is that the court must rely upon others to carry out its decisions. Writing in the Federalist Papers to support ratification of the Constitution, Alexander Hamilton argued that the Supreme Court would not be too powerful because it had neither the power of the purse nor the sword. What this means is that the court doesn't control any government funds, so they can't use monetary threats or inducements to carry out their decisions in the real world. Nor do they have the law enforcement power of the executive branch to use things like arrest and detention or possible military force as a way of giving power to their decisions. Instead, the court's true power lies in its perceived legitimacy. Congress and the President use their powers of the purse and sword to enforce Supreme Court decisions to the extent those decisions are broadly recognized as legitimate. This is usually the case, but the court tries to be cognizant of not getting too far out of line with popular sentiment or sentiment in the elected branches out of fear that their decisions might not be implemented. Additionally, the power of the court lies in its ability to establish precedents that guide decisions of future cases. Technically, the Supreme Court decides which side wins in a specific legal dispute between two parties. That alone is a relatively minor power. Their influence lies in guiding future behavior in similar cases by providing clarity to how the Constitution and the law will be applied. For instance, the recent Obergefell landmark case was technically about one gay couple seeking a marriage license, but the legal reasoning provided by the court in determining that the state was required to give that couple a marriage license was universal. In other words, the same reasoning applied for all gay couples seeking marriage licenses in all states throughout the country. While certainly not everyone agreed with that decision, it was generally recognized that the court had the legitimate authority to make the decision, and it has been implemented with relatively little resistance. But let's look at a case where the court's legitimacy to carry out its decision was more deeply questioned and resisted. The case of Brown v. Board of Education was the landmark case overturning the separate but equal precedent of Plessy v. Ferguson that had allowed legal racial segregation for over half a century. The Brown case was technically about school choice for 13 parents in Topeka, Kansas, who wanted the school board to allow them to send their children to schools that had been all white. And the Supreme Court ruled in their favor and instructed Topeka to integrate their schools. But the deeper significance of the case is that the legal reasoning that led the justices to overturn segregation in Topeka also applied to school districts throughout the country. Therefore, the court ruled that all states needed to desegregate their schools with all deliberate speed. This was easier said than done, as it would take the better part of 20 years for the decision to be implemented in every state. In the picture on this slide, the gentleman in the middle is Thurgood Marshall, who was the lawyer for the NAACP's Legal Defense Fund, who successfully argued the Brown case in oral arguments before the Supreme Court. He would later go on to become the first African-American justice on the Supreme Court, appointed by Lyndon Johnson in 1967. 4 years after the Brown decision, most southern states still maintained legal segregation in defiance of the Supreme Court's decision. This highlights the limitations of the court's power, as it had no control over education funding to the states, so it couldn't apply any form of financial pressure, nor did it command a police force or militia with which to enforce its order. Ultimately, the Brown decision was implemented bit by bit throughout the country. A big part of that implementation came as a result of actions taken by the executive and legislative branches to enforce school desegregation. For instance, President Eisenhower sent in National Guard troops to guarantee the safe integration of Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas, over the vociferous objections of that state's governor. And the Civil Rights Act of 1964 gave a substantial boost to school desegregation by withholding funds to states if they did not integrate. At the same time, as presidents and Congress took action to carry out the Brown decision in the real world, public opinion also began to shift as Americans moved from a very divided split on integration to a clear majority in favor over the course of several years. Because of its perceived legitimacy, the court not only succeeded in gaining support from the other branches, it also helped shape public opinion around this very hot-button issue. It's somewhat ironic. The Brown decision is rightly looked upon as one of the most important landmark decisions in Supreme Court history. But the decision was least successful at achieving the specific goal of school integration. While legal racial segregation of schools is a thing of the past, the American education system is still highly segregated by race, with fewer children attending school with classmates from different racial groups than was the case in 1980. This has to do with things like housing choices made by individual families, and the end of political support for school district busing programs to achieve racial integration. But that should not overshadow the fact that the Brown decision was a galvanizing moment for the civil rights movement, overturning the legal rationale behind racial segregation, molding public opinion in support of greater racial equality, and nudging presidents and Congress into action to take a stand for racial equality.